the two strong muscles I would, like everyone to build, whether you're early stage or whatever stage in career or life, I think is what I call resilience and empathy. And in a sense, they're both related.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Second Innings podcast series. As usual, Suman, Ghose and I, Atul, Nath, are your hosts this afternoon. Why do we really do this podcast? Because purpose, passion, joy are becoming more and more important to some of us in our life and in our work journeys. And we love talking about these things. Many of us are pursuing this through rediscovering ourselves by changing tracks in our lives to a second innings. In this podcast, we're exploring through conversations with people who have done such transitions in their careers and their lives. We uncover their stories, their experiences, and their learnings. Telling and listening to such stories helps all of us. Today, we are going to be talking to Lloyd Mathias. Lloyd is a business strategist and an investor, and he's one of the leading voices in the world of business in India. He invests, partners, and collaborates with founders of early stage companies in the areas of AI, social commerce, data analytics, and digital technology. Lloyd is on the boards of many listed companies as an independent director. These include Quantum Asset Management Company, Protean eGov Technologies, HT's DigiContent Limited, Fever Radio, and Next Media Works Limited. Before he was doing all of this, Lloyd was the marketing head of the Asia business of HP Inc., as also before that, the president and CMO of Tata Teleservices, country sales director for Motorola, executive VP marketing and category director for PepsiCo, India and South Asia. He has been behind some of the best marketing campaigns in our country over the past few years. Really envy a lot of the great work that he's done with so many great teams and so many agencies that I've had a chance to work with as well. He is a well-recognized thought leader. Lloyd has written multiple op-eds, columns, and has been quoted on business and policy issues in several Indian and international media. I'm going to be asking him in this episode when we're going to be getting a book out of Lloyd. It's hopefully going to be soon. Great to have you with us, Lloyd. I can't wait to get stuck in this conversation. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Atul. Wonderful chatting with you and Suman. And, with Atul, as you know, we go back a long time. Always enjoyed the passion and energy that you brought into entrepreneurship when it wasn't all that fashionable being a startup, but back in the mid 90s with Candid. So always wonderful to be with you. And like they say, books are now a little for the older folks. I think podcasts are it. So absolutely doubly privileged to be on you guys' show.
Maybe you should just catch hold of all your conversations and put it in AI and it'll churn out a book for you in one shot. That shouldn't be too difficult to do. Okay, so we're going to kick this off, Lloyd, with asking you to give us a little backstory of your early years, as a person. What shaped you as a young boy and as a young man growing up with your parents, your friends, your siblings, etc., etc. I would love to hear that early backstory.
Super. So grew up in Mumbai in the 70s. Not the best of times in a manner of speaking. This was the pre-liberalization era, but a very simplistic, what we'd call a very middle-class life. Though very often now I encounter friends who say that what a lot of Indians dismiss as middle class is actually still that top 2% of this country, but be that as it may. So grew up in a suburb of Mumbai called Chembur, did my school there, went to college at St. Xavier's. Then, like most people, did the GMAT and the GRE and hoped to go across the US. But as you know, you needed 4 years of graduate education. So I took an MBA entrance, it worked out and stayed back. So, one thing leads to the other. So pretty much you can say a very standard kind of middle class, big city kind of existence, where you just had fun and went with the flow, didn't have huge aspirations and not half as smart as teens now are, where they have their life so clearly charted out and they want to retire by the mid 30s. I think I was far away from that, but just had a cool, nice, easy growing up here. The only thing stand out I would talk about...
Surely sounds like a top 2% middle class. Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I would say, two passions that have kind of stayed with me right through. I think one was pretty early in school, I discovered a passion for quizzing. So I was a very avid quizzer, represented my school and then on to college. So quizzing and trivia was a huge passion driver. And the second thing I enjoyed quite a bit was writing a bit, right? And this is like from school magazines and then later on to college. So found writing as a good outlet, initially more because it was just nice and fun to do. But now increasingly more, it helps me kind of structure my thoughts. Every time you want to say something, I'm pretty comfortable putting it down on a sheet of paper, and that kind of helped me frame my thoughts. So I think those things have been kind of core to my early growing up years that have stayed with me for a long time.
Yeah, as they say, if you really want to master something and think about something, you should write it down because that really helps to develop the thought process. And I think that an early stage development of that kind of habit must have been great for you.
Yeah, but like I said, more just out of passion. But now you realize a lot of the worth of it, right? Though we use our pencils and pens less, now we do it on the computer. But it certainly, like I totally agree with you, it helps you structure your thinking. And they say, as you know, if you really want to master something, A, write about it. But second is stand up in front of an audience and speak about it. So I try both of these with limited success, but I do try.
Is there something about your childhood years which kind of shaped you in a way that or influenced you in terms of doing what you did in later years?
Suman, I would say a couple of things. I think one is, like for most Indians growing up my generation, I think college opened up a whole new world, right? Your school typically tended to be in the neighborhood, similar profiles, similar cohorts, people your parents knew. It was a small little oyster. And then the moment you went to college, same city though, but this was St. Xavier's in Bombay, it suddenly opened up a much larger world, right? For one, that was a co-ed college, right? And by the time the school I went to was an all-boys school. So one, it just opened up a larger world. But two, it suddenly made one aware of so many possibilities, right? Most of us just went with the flow, right?
Yeah.
Well, ICSE, then you go and do your take science with the hope that you might get into the medical or engineering streams and one of those things. And then suddenly realized that there was such a body of learning. And I also say that the St. Xavier's of the East was an interesting time. For one, it offered a lot of non-core academic courses. They had something called a PHV, a Personality and Human Values. So every year of college, and college in Bombay then was from the 11th, 12th, and 3 years of graduation. You could take one optional course just completely out of your stream. So that was, hugely beneficial. I remember I did a film appreciation course and things you would not normally learn. I think that was a great leveling. And to us, as we all do, we suddenly build some of those networks for life. Friends from very, very different backgrounds, from very different cultures, just understand a much larger sphere of the world. And I think Xavier's of that period did offer quite an opportunity. It was also a period, and I must say this, is that, going to a college in town in St. Xavier's was not easy because in the early 80s, you still had that little stigma of, oh my God, drugs were a big thing. And parents were a little uncomfortable because Xavier's had a bit of that, sense of, so one had to push the limits of saying, no, I want to go there because I just think it's a nicer college. It, gives me a whole new sense of myself, going to town, commuting a good half hour away from home and such like. So I think that was, to my mind, quite some of those memories still stay fresh and something that kind of opened up the larger dimension of the world to me.
So tell me, Lloyd, where did marketing and business become? What were the beginnings of that for your functional choice of career? When did that come up? During your MBA, post that? How did that come about?
Not really, Atul. So the MBA was, like I said, I did MBA at Bombay University, did kind of dual major with marketing and finance, and then, aspired to get a job. This was, remember, the pre-liberalization era. I started working in 1988, a good 4 years before Dr. Singh and P.V. Narasimha Rao did the liberalization. So it was still, in a sense, an old world economy. I joined a company called Onida. I did a 3-year stint in sales. Good fun. It just, you learn, travel around the country, made sales calls, handled dealer networks. I did an institutional sales stint. So it was just trying to get one's way around business, but learning a lot of the routine of selling. And I'm very glad that those days, you kind of got pushed into sales as the bottom rung of the management training hierarchy. But I quite enjoyed that stint. And what I also realized that sales was a good way of meeting people from very diverse parts of the country, right? So I did travel. I remember I used to handle at one point Vidarbha, which was Western Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh. And we spent 15, 20 days on the road. But lots of learnings and quite enjoyed that. Marketing was never big, though it was always aspirational. So I always remembered that the company did these great campaigns with an agency called Avenues, and it would be part of these conferences when the Onida Devil was presented. So it was always something you aspired towards. But it was a out and out kind of sales role. And then towards the end, I got into a small kind of marketing support role, right? So I was sales in charge for a part of the Western region, institutional sales, with additional charge of also handling marketing for that region. And which was really about kind of planning point of sale material, signage and such like. So it wasn't really kind of cerebral marketing in a manner of speaking, but it was exciting. It was exciting to be with that one. But that's where a little bit of the interest got triggered on. And then moving on, so after that stint at Onida, I did a short 2 years, first break into beverages with a company called Herbertsons, which was part of the UB group, Mr. Malia's.
I remember that.
Soon thereafter, I did my first product management stint. So I got to handle a brand called Bagpiper Whiskey, which was the largest selling whiskey in the country then, right? 3 million cases back in 1992.
Probably still is.
Yeah, it was a phenomenally large whiskey. In a funny way, unbeknownst to a lot of people, it was like what we call within the UB business. It was like what a lady film star came of age when Lux made her a brand ambassador, right? Everyone from Meena Kumari to Zina Daman to Katrina Kaif today or whoever is their current ambassador. We'd say the same version was Bagpiper because Bagpiper had it all, right? From Shatrughan Sinha, Sunil Dutt, all the way down to Rajesh Khanna, and most recently, they've had a lot of Akshay Kumar or whatever. But now movie stars are uncomfortable with the whole category, so we had a whole series of them. So it was exciting because we did what was that era's version of celebrity advertising. I think till the 90s, it was still okay to advertise. So doing billboards with movie stars like Dharmendra and such like were par for the course. Subsequently, of course, one had to use surrogates, club soda and playing cards and all the rest of it. But it was exciting. And it was a very different category because a lot of liquor marketing was really about influencing your sales and distribution network. But more importantly, and I think the best thing that happened was liberalization happened during that period. Kind of Pepsi was the first multinational to come back to India, they say, in 14 years. And them as the marketing head for the Western region. And this was way back in 93, 94. So one of the early days. And this was when I would still say possibly among the first 50 employees, because prior to that, Pepsi was a franchise company where it actually sold beverages through a clutch of bottlers. And in 93, they took the decision to go directly with, as a company that would directly be in front of consumers, running their own bottling business. A team to work with. And truly an exciting time for a young person in his 20s, getting involved with a global brand that was doing all the fun things that you enjoy, right? So it was cricket, it was movies, it was the latest music shows. You were partner to some of them. It was a great time.
Absolutely.
But
and it's fascinating. I think this is one of the common themes to a lot of our podcast episodes, Lloyd, even for people who are in their 40s, definitely 50s, is that liberalization and post-liberalization, the change in India and the economy has played such an important role in shaping of careers for all of us, right? In one way or another, either as an entrepreneur or as in a marketing company or whatever type of company. And of course, the IT services boom post that has had a great impact too. And so I think this is a common theme. All of us realize that the post-liberalization period allowed all of us to build our careers in such a fascinating manner. Tell me, and we spoke about this the other day when you and I were talking, that through your career, you worked with all the greatest, some of the greatest brands and product categories, whether it was beverages and then mobile phones and then mobile phone services. But through all these categories, were there stages at which you thought to yourself that maybe I should transition into doing something on my own or be an entrepreneur? What was that like over the various stages of your career?
I'll just make 2 points. I think one is, did the thought of being an entrepreneur occur to me in my 20s and 30s? Sadly, not. And I'll tell you why I say sadly. But before that, since you did mention the liberalization issue, I want to say that I remember batchmates of mine when we got together for a 10-year reunion, right? So this was 88 to 98. Almost all of us said that for that short period between 92 and 95, most of our salaries had quadrupled or more. Right? Because we all came into that pre-liberalization era when a starting management trainee stipend was in that 4,000 or 5,000 rupee bracket, right? And here we were 10 years later looking back, and suddenly we said that around 95, suddenly that was the kind of money that you'd laugh at. You'd say, oh my God, I mean, why would anyone want to have work done? This was just a short period, right? Now it sounds crazy. But therefore we saw that there was one significant leap, right? So I think that was one, important point that I wanted to make. In terms of the second question and the point about, I wish I'd possibly entertained entrepreneurial thoughts much earlier. But the reason one did, and I think therefore it's also a little bit of a part of that generation that really began their work career in the 90s, is that increments and growth and ESOPs were kind of coming fairly easy, that it kind of got us into a trap of comfort, right? Most of us came in from whatever you'd say, a very middle class background. And suddenly here we were being able to upgrade our car every 2 years and get those fancy music systems that we only hoped that our parents could one day afford pretty easily, right? So life was kind of moving up fairly comfortably. And to some extent, if I look at kids today, it's something that gave us a sense of comfort that why do you want to do anything more? As long as you do enough to, get your promotion, make your next sales target, go to your next international conference, get a couple of levels up on the organization, you're sorted, right? And I would think in a small way, it was a bit of a trap. When a lot of us look back at, new age entrepreneurs in their 20s striking it on their own, I think to some extent we missed the bus largely because there really was no read, right? Things were looking good. The future was rosy. The India story was building up. Things were just improving. Our lives were getting better year on year. So there wasn't any need. And that's something I think is slightly more peculiar to the folks who really kind of built their work life in the 90s, not so much as of today.
So this is very interesting, Lloyd. So you have done lots of interesting work in the corporate world, but worked for the entire 30 years, right? 88, right up through till 2018, when you came out of the corporate thing.
Absolutely.
And then you started doing lots of other very interesting things. And so my question is around that. So a lot of people we speak to, they either harbor these thoughts and that at some point they make the change. For a lot of the people who've been through the entire journey, by the time they come out, the worlds are so different, the corporate world as the outside world. So I have two questions for you. One is that what made you do this mindset shift, right, in terms of doing so many different things after you retired? And I won't even call it a retirement. You're like full on, right? Retired from corporate life. And where do you get that energy from? Was there something already happening while you were working? Or when you were leaving the corporate world, were you sure that, okay, I'm going to do these plethora of things? How did it all work out?
So great question, Suman, and thank you for asking that. I'll take two things. I think one, the reason why I find myself so active today or doing lots of fun things, I think partially is an account of fact that there was a lot of suppressed energies, the things that you ought to have done possibly 15, 20 years ago, broken out, been an entrepreneur. I think a lot of that suppressed energy, in a sense, vicariously exhibits itself through the startups one is involved with, right? So that's one part that I will certainly admit to. But the transition...
Why suppressed?
Like I said, in the 90s, one was so comfortable, and in the early 2000s, work was good, growth was assured, things were working well, that one never thought about it. Now, in retrospect, if I was to go and look back, maybe that was the time when you had all the energy and maybe you could have pursued a passion, do something differently. And maybe entrepreneurship was then not so easy. And I do believe that the funding ecosystem in India has really evolved in the last 10 years. Folks from my batch and much later would never think of branching off on their own, because just getting that poor money to get started while just building the early days of your family, right? Most of them just got married or had young kids. It was a no-go, right? Today, the funding system is evolved, right? A young kid with a reasonably smart idea who's able to present it in front of a bunch of angel investors can get enough to take his idea to fruition, to a proof of concept or whatever in a year, year and a half, keeping his family in tenterhooks, right? So there could be enough to cover his salary and experiment with the idea, build a core team with a founder, co-founder, and I'm involved with that process quite satisfactorily, right? His lifestyle won't take a big setback. I don't think that was possible well into the late 90s. I met early stage entrepreneurs like Sajeev Bichchandani. I think even they had to build a little corpus before they made those tentative steps, right? It wasn't so carefree as you see youngsters getting out of business schools or any school these days, who's happy saying that I'm going to take the first 2-3 years, try my hand at entrepreneurship. If it works, so good. If it doesn't, I can always get myself back to a job. So I think that part was something that I would say I missed out on. On the transition, I could spend a couple of minutes talking about it. I think there are two parts here. The first was really, I think, back in 2014. I used to work with HP as marketing head for the Asia region. Companies do those little socks that sometimes, are worth a lifetime. HP sent me to a 2-month residential program at the London Business School. One of the courses, just a quick background, is that this program was those with 25 years work ex. So everyone in that batch was about roughly 50 or approaching 50. I think I was 48 when it happened. For the first time, it was an interesting cohort. Only half the class was from corporates. The other half, the other 25, came from 5 different categories: military service, bureaucrats, politicians, not-for-profits, and the 5th category, I forget. But they were all non-corporates. I remember the first case study we did were a group of 4 of us. The other gentleman was from Procter & Gamble. We were quickly into solving a case study, and one of the guys was great. In fact, he was a rear admiral in the Royal Navy. He said, guys, do you realize there are lives at stake here, right? All you've been discussing on this case study is about return to shareholders. And suddenly woke us up. One of the interesting programs in that 2-month program was the 100-Year Life. And this is a book that was just written then by 2 professors of the London Business School And it started off very interesting. The book starts off with this interesting proposition that in 2014, a kid born in Japan has an 8 in 10 chance of living up to 100, right? So the core proposition of that book really was the fact that a lot of us in more affluent societies are going to have much longer lifespans than our parents and certainly our grandparents. The other part the book focuses on is saying that the linearity of corporate careers is gone. Folks like me who got into the corporate world in the late 80s and 90s, you had a standard management trainee, and most companies had a 10, 12-year career plan where you'd roughly end up after 15 years. It says now CEOs don't know if they're going to have their job 3 quarters down the line. More importantly, seniority doesn't matter. Most of the folks who worked for Mark Zuckerberg in his first 10 years were all elder to him. So the whole proposition, that whole book and that particular course that everyone really bonded upon was saying, how do you guys plan the rest of your life, right? Most of you guys are in your late 40s, possibly 50. Don't assume that you've got 5 or 10 years of the corporate world and then, you close shop and you play golf. You just have to plan for the next 30, 40. And the book talks about specific vectors, right? Financially, how do you work towards that long second? Socially, what do you need to do to reinvent, to stay relevant to a new world? In terms of your own learnings, right? I remember one of the sentences that always stayed with me was almost everything you've learned in your first 10 years since leaving business school is very irrelevant, right? I'd learned the art of fast moving consumer good distribution. I was like a distribution expert. I knew all the basic tenets of marketing, media planning. A lot of these today are easily outsourceable, right? A lot of startups don't need to understand working a distribution network. You go to a third party logistics service provider and you're done for, right? A lot of marketing is not about buying media and creating huge commercials. It's about doing performance marketing, doing digital marketing, doing influencer, none of which existed 10 or 15 years ago. The whole exercise was really about saying, how do you reinvent yourself for the future? And that process will not start when you turn 60 or 63 or 65 or whatever is the retirement age, but has to start now. And therefore, my big take from that was, hey, if I don't think through how my next 20 years are going to look like, it's going to be very difficult. And I also had the opportunity to reflect personally on, let's say, my dad. When he retired, he worked for one company for about 41 years. I think he was 62 when he retired. My mom would keep saying that he didn't know what to do with his life, right? Because the only thing he'd done successfully for 41 years is work, right? And so then he'd be at a loose end. Every day he'd like, what do I do? Go for a walk and whatever. So I think, in a sense, it kind of cautioned me, but more importantly, told me that if I don't plan for this long haul, it won't happen. And therefore, in 2014, thanks to that 100-year life part of the London Business School Senior Executive Program, I got down to thinking through, how do I want to work the rest of my life? And that's when I asked myself some serious questions, continued with the organization, loved what I did with HP. But I think that put the seeds of what I'm doing today, which is really working with younger people, working with startups, breaking out of the echo chamber of, they say, as you get older, you work with folks or you hang out with folks who are just clones of yourself, right? Same school, same network, same neighborhoods, same economic status, very often similar political thoughts. And this whole program was about, how do you break that echo chamber, right? When you hang out with a bunch of 29-year-olds who don't give a damn about all the CXO cards that you held all your life, you just bring value to them for that very transaction. And just to figure out how they think about things, their conversations, what moves them, what are their, I think a lot of that rubs off. So I think for me, that was a big, turning point. And thereafter, I was like clear that, I wouldn't do another corporate role. I'd certainly want to start getting involved with this, either directly as an entrepreneur or someone who works closely with that ecosystem without, direct skin in the game, in a manner of speaking.
It's amazing, and you're lucky, Lloyd, that you got that opportunity and probably came at the right time in your career, because had it been another 5, 8 years later, it would have had different ramifications.
Absolutely.
Two of the things you talked about are actually classic second innings drivers, and I'm just going to underline those. One was about linearity of career, which is something that has completely changed. And the second is lifespan. I think those two things are something Suman and I have talked about many, many times, that sitting where we are, as old as we are today, we're going to live far longer than our parents, for sure. And as a result, we need to plan for it accordingly. Financial as well as mental and emotional, intellectual development.
I was talking on this along the same lines. There's a linearity that we talked about. See, going back to school was also non-linear. See, the way we progress, and typically is that your learning is supposed to be ending by in your 20s, right? Clearly hearing you, I can sense that a lot of reflection happened. You almost pivoted at that time based on the feedback that you got from other people, and that happened because HP sent you there, right? But before you went to B school, were you kind of expecting a lot? Or for somebody who's like, let's say, in their late 40s, who wants to do something, who's aligned on this thought process, hey, I've still got 20, 30 years ahead of me, but corporate life may be just a few years. Would you reckon them to kind of go and do a program like that, for instance?
Yes, Suman. The reason I'm saying so would be that well into one's 20s and 30s, you're still very focused on your corporate goals, right? There are a lot of ambitions, which is typically tends to be in terms of growth and, where do you want to get in the hierarchy. And I guess every one of us sets kind of personal ambitions and goals. And a lot of them willy-nilly tend to be unilateral, right? Because we've spent now 15, 20 years investing into our, our careers, our particular sectors, particular knowledge bases. We hope that this linear track is what is going to get us to, a better life and enjoy ourselves. I think what programs like this do is really help you break out of that mindset and think through your life more holistically, saying that now is the time. And I do believe late 30s and early 40s is when a lot of the hard questions have to confront people. And I'd say this not just in a corporate career way, but also in terms of health. Most of us recognize that in our 20s and 30s, we're young, the body is good, you can do those late night partying and still wake up in morning to take a red eye and make it. But as you reach your 40s, suddenly your body starts to protest. You suddenly realize that years of making sales calls and late night drinks haven't done too well for yourself. So you get that hard look at your next annual medical checkup and such like. So I think people do very often reflect or are forced to reflect at that point in time, and therefore have to make these changes. I think a program like this helps accelerate and puts far more clarity. I mean, if I could just dwell on the 4 vectors that specifically came out of the program. One was the need to kind of retrain oneself, recognizing that your knowledge of 15, 20 years ago is redundant, and therefore you have to consciously go and learn, right? Long before work from home and such like became. So this was something it really thought kind of made one reflect upon. The second was obviously the physical. Take care of your physical and your financial health, right? You are not going to be being taken care of for the rest of your life by kids or family or whatever. You've got to plan. What if you live till 90? Are you still good to go? And therefore, do you plan accordingly? Are you physically and mentally going to be ready for it, right? Do you want to engage yourself intellectually so that, like you said earlier, the old model was first 20 years you learn, next 40 years you earn, and then, so to speak, you yearn for the good life and hopefully you'll be able to live it. Now, can you actually work towards what those things are? But the most important dimension of that was really, to my mind, was breaking out of the social echo chamber, saying that as you get into your late 40s and such like, you suddenly build a cohort or a cocoon of people who are very, very similar to you. The moment you break out of that, and I'd love to give you a little story. I think when I first got back from Singapore and I was talking to a few VCs. One of them put me on to a few portfolio companies. So 2 or 3 companies, I was in a sense a consultant coming from the VC. Not a good route to come in because you're coming from the funder. So you're looked at with a lot of skepticism from founders. And one of the things I used to do normally, and this was a furniture rental company based in Bangalore, was saying that I insist on spending a day or two with the founders, understanding the people, right? Much younger than I am, certainly financially more successful. And I would also, going through my old corporate habits, insist on seeing their sales books and seeing how they get their business. And again, old instincts, I would want to meet a few customers to see how happy they were. I discovered that a furniture rental company, which I thought was really about supplying very basic furniture for a young techie in his 20s, was actually doing a lot more, right? There's a whole generation of young couples, not just young, people in their 30s and 40s, who want custom-built furniture to fit their new 3-bedroom apartment. And when they change employers and they move from, let's say, a different part of the city, in this case, say Bangalore moved from Electronic City to Koramangala, where they moved from a 3-bedroom to a 2-bedroom, now they want repurposed but much better furniture. They weren't willing to cart old furniture and retrofit it. Learning.
Interesting.
And then I asked for some outliers, and one incident blew my mind. One of the founders told me about one of their customers who asked for an Anjali Ilamenan painting, which she wanted to adorn on a wall for a short duration. She was going to have some of her international visitors. She was a garment exporter, and she wanted to cast the right impression on them. And it was a penny drop moment for me. I remember I called my wife and said, you know what, there are young people who are renting quality art to cast an impression. I mean, what a different world from the world on which we inhabit, right? You buy art because it satisfies your soul and makes you feel good. And then suddenly realize that there are these evolving business models which are profitable, which a lot of big VC firms have bet large amount of money on. And they were so peripheral to my thought, right? So what I increasingly found exciting and what drives me to an extent is suddenly you learn about things in a vastly different manner, right? And that to my mind is the little learning that kind of keeps me going and keeps me quite excited. My wife keeps reminding me saying that I've never felt more excited about the things I do now than I did over the many years of working life, because that was more predictable and routine. And as you know, as you grow, a lot of it becomes administrative. So you're doing more of the same. Here, it's almost every encounter is new. There's a great potential for learning. And if I could just take another couple of minutes to add another story, it's also that for a lot of the young entrepreneurs I work with, your value lies not in the experience that you bring in. It's what do you bring in at every meeting, at every interaction. Again, in the pretty early stage company, I remember I told the founders that why don't you do a Monday morning weekly call? And one of them laughed at me and said, I speak to my colleagues like every hour. Why do I need to get them all on a call on Monday? I said, look, I recognize that. But, my advice, let's try it for a couple of weeks. Doesn't work, you win, right? And therefore, Monday morning, he did an all hands call. Mornings, a lot of startups is 12 o'clock in the afternoon. Most of the guys report in late. That's another story. 12 to 1, he had the whole team, and he started off with an introductory remark, and then he had his regional head, so to speak. And the first thing he said next week was, he said, suddenly there was an element of competition, right? When the guy in the South said that he was doing X, Y, Z, and the guy in the East felt that he wasn't doing enough, he said, suddenly a lot of the guys called back and said, next week I'll do better. And that became institutionalized. So I told him that, look, this is tragically what a lot of legacy companies only do. So don't get to that stage. But certainly some of the routines of big businesses are worth emulating, because they certainly put a lot of practices in place which help your business. More importantly, they send a great signal to the investor world. When you go to your investors and you tell them that these are my last 4 weekly sales reports and here's the process I follow, there's a lot more respect. So I just think sometimes it's just the value we bring, but often it's really about bringing some of the old legacy business processes into newer businesses, which they can then adapt to a more relevant manner.
Yeah. And it also requires adapting for yourself, because you're learning, you're unlearning old business models, learning new business models, at the same time figuring out what from the old world will still work here.
Absolutely smart.
Yeah. Now, we talked a lot on the what and the how. I'm still asking the why question. Going back to your analogy of the learn, earn, and earn, why does somebody? Okay, let me put it differently. I have a friend who worked for 30 years, very successful, came out, started doing something different, didn't last long. At some point, he said, he must have told himself, why am I even doing this? I have a good corpus and I'm getting older. So now he's playing golf and he's going all over the world. Right. So what's the motivation to keep driving yourself so hard?
That's a damn good question.
Great, Suman. So I'd say a lot of one's self-worth is actually a little bit about what you are able to do with a slightly larger context. One small part is giving back to society, but also the fact that some may or may not acknowledge it, you derive a lot of your self-worth by what you put out there in the public domain, right? Who do you work with? What do you do? And this typically is a kind of state that people with limited financial insecurities, right? You say that you met, let's say to a large extent, your commercial and financial goals. Yes. So your lifestyle is not going to radically alter one way or the other without having to pursue money as your primary goal. So in a sense, it's part self-actualization. But I recognize that, and I have friends that just staying back, reading books and playing golf, which one aspires to do in one's leisure time, can't be a full-time, long-term occupation. And I'll go back to the 100-year life and say a lot of that is not very good for your physical and mental health, right? There is a value in staying engaged, albeit not stretching oneself. So it's not about doing 12-hour days and kind of getting back to the grind routine, but doing a fair amount of productive work. Now, this could be commercially oriented. This could be working with a not-for-profit, and that's pretty good. But just between chilling on a beach, playing golf, and reading a book, to my mind, doesn't make for a complete life. And I do believe, and I've had deep conversations with lots of friends of my vintage, I do sense that a lot of them feel the need to be more relevant, just that they don't make enough effort. Right. Okay. And a lot of times it's also not the outside perception. And I've gone through that. And one of my big learnings has been that for a lot of startup founders, having an older dude in the room who's been senior somewhere is not a very pleasant experience, right? So he's the gray hair who's come to criticize them, specifically when you come from the funding side, which I thankfully stopped doing some time ago. It's always it's a mix of resentment and what value can he add. But the moment you break that barrier and you get deeply involved with them as a one-on-one, then the age factor and all that doesn't matter, right? Then you become one of the team. So I believe that it's very important. I believe in all the transactions I have with founders and with startups which I've invested in, I have much more to gain. Right at the end of it, a lot of them feel that they've learned a lot, and I hope that stays. The fact is, you learn much more, right? Because they're dealing with a more current situation. A lot of them are first-hand founders who actually gone out and built products themselves, of which I have no capabilities whatsoever. Try and push them a little bit in terms of building a second line, giving them some counsel in terms of how to approach a sales call, how to be more methodical about the approach. So a lot of my value is more in structure, in process, in building a second sales line, in looking at things that could come and hurt them 2 or 3 years down the line, right? A lot of startup founders build things with a lot of shortcuts, hiring from personal friends, taking on real estate because my spouse's brother is runs or whatever. And I say, look, 3 years from now, when you're standing in front of a Series C funder, these are conflicts of interest, right? Issues like this can come back to bite you hard. And the moment you're able to look at a 3 to 5 year horizon and paint that picture for them, suddenly they look back and say, wow, right? So for a 28-year-old, a 5 year horizon is like eternity, right? That's the kind of value one brings because you've lived through a lot of that crisis. So always kind of helping them navigate that 3 to 5 year window. I think that's the value I bring. And if I could just segue from there, I think it's also the value, and it's the other part of what I do, as Atul so graciously called out in the interaction, is also today I recognize that a lot of CEOs in the boards I sit on, a lot of the younger CEOs need board members who are not necessarily retired bureaucrats and there for the sitting fee and the lunch, but who can help them look at a 3 to 5 year horizon, which their day-to-day routine does not permit. A bunch of guys who can help them get a second opinion on their CXOs, which they cannot have from any other person. People who are watching them every quarter, watching the CXOs. And therefore, I believe two ends of what I do. One is working, say, 50-60% of the time with startup founders. But the boards I sit on, I believe there's a lot of value that folks like me who spend a long years in the corporate world can bring, helping CEOs navigate the future in a 3 to 4 year window. All right. And therefore, I believe, and I'm happy to see this process happening, is a lot of boards are turning slightly more younger. Right. When I was in the corporate world, Tata's, we had a publicly listed company. The average age of the director was mid-70s. He was a retired babu, secretary level government of India, or he was a tax chief at one of the big four companies, or he was a lawyer of repute, right? So the whole idea was CYA. Now, a lot of companies are trying to get boards with guys in their 50s who are still very current, who understand the scenario, who are able to kind of help the company look at a 2-3 year horizon. But more importantly, we're bringing some kind of domain expertise, be it finance, be it consumer insights or marketing or whatever. And I think that's the other part that I enjoy, spend a lot of time with.
No, I'm sure you're bringing a lot of value, and that's the reason why you're engaging and they're hearing what you're saying. But I'm just going back to what we were discussing initially as to where does the motivation come from, and I think it has a lot to do with that 100-year life that you talked about. See, when somebody retired at late 50s, and if they were living till late 60s, you could just do an earn and just chill. But if somebody's living till 90, after retirement, you know that duration is probably as long as longer than your first innings, isn't it? So obviously you will have to do something which is of value. And Atul and I have talked a lot about this, and suddenly there's a dearth of identity for people who come out of a corporate, and if you're not doing anything, okay, you may have all the money, but who are you? It's very difficult for them to have an identity. And I think that's where the relevant work comes in.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the quest for the identity is a great point, Suman. Sorry, Atul, go ahead.
No. Suman, you were talking about the earlier, the what and the how and the why related to that. And I think that definitely plays a big role. And knowing Lloyd and the way he's articulated it right now, his why is very strong, as in multiple whys. One, to make sure that he lives emotionally, psychologically, physically, mentally healthier in the next 20-30 years, and that's a very strong why. I feel that there is a certain amount of the what and the how also in it, which impacts the why. Lloyd, you mentioned about sometimes it's very difficult to do. especially later in your post career. And I think one of the biggest strengths, and I've seen it in you and I've seen it in a few other people, is simply showing up. A lot of people don't have the simple drive of showing up, actually coming out and learning, being a lifelong learner. And as a result, going into passive mode of just playing golf and sitting on the beach is what is a very easy thing to do, right? It's being passive is very easy in life. So that's one thing that I just wanted to kind of call out. The other is more of a question to you, Lloyd, which is that you talked about the fact that there was a certain linearity to a career over, let's say, the 2000s and maybe the 2010s as well. Now, you work with a lot of young entrepreneurs, and within those entrepreneurial organizations with team members who are in their 20s, some in their 30s, probably. Some of the boards there are a lot of CEOs who must be in their 30s and 40s as well, maybe more like 40s, I suppose. Now, in this next generation, do you see a certain recognition of this portfolio approach, or a certain recognition that there's going to be something different in life? Is that why they transitioned into startups and entrepreneurs? What's your viewpoint on those people and their second rings or their transitions?
Great question, Atul. There are two sides to this. I think one, there's a bunch of people who come confronted with what do I do, who are typically in their early to mid 40s, who reach that stage when, for whatever reason, restructuring, etc., their role becomes redundant, right? And they also suddenly realize that at that particular stage, the offers aren't too many because they've already reached a certain kind of salary bracket that makes them, to an extent, unaffordable. So that's one group of people. The only folks willing to pay them that kind of money come from the new age ecosystem, the digital ecosystem, who are looking, ironically, for people with experience in that domain. So legacy is bad news. You could have been part of the storied organization and just not relevant enough for a new age organization. A company that's born 10 years ago that may be listed today. So that becomes a challenge. The other are folks who recognize consciously, and these are folks possibly in the latter 40s, who suddenly realize that if we don't get into a new age company, we're going to be doomed for imminent disaster, right? You're on a legacy company, you're on a high paid job, things are pretty smooth. There could be one bad quarter or two bad quarters, your company is going to restructure. Now, having worked for a good 25 years of your life in a well-structured organization, why is anyone going to hire you? And, a storied Fortune 500 company, but what kind of relevance do you bring to the startup ecosystem? And the other Fortune 500 companies either are going through a similar crisis or are very happy to promote from within. Right? They have enough younger talent who are 5-10 years junior who can grow into these roles. So I think both of these sets of cohorts are into that kind of question. It's just that today the comfort levels or the assurance of jobs is declining progressively. Right? I'm not even going to what AI can disrupt in the next 3 or 4 years. Right? That could be a whole different order of magnitude. But I think that's the reality. The second point, which I'd like to hark back to something we spoke about earlier, is that a lot of the skills are more digitally oriented. So the years of hard hours you put building up distribution, learning the elements of auditing, doing whatever you did very well is now going to be increasingly easily replaceable either through technology or for younger folks who are going to put 12 hours at work, right? Which at this time you don't possibly have the time or the ability to kind of put in those long hours. So I think both these sets are up for disruption. And therefore, my belief is that if you don't plan for it right now, you don't want to be caught flat-footed. It's also the period in life when there are a lot of dependencies. You suddenly reach a certain economic level, see yourself in a certain light. Your kids are used to a certain school, your spouse, etc. So you live a certain lifestyle that you bought into, right? It's not easy to backtrack. So I think that's the process that a lot of people kind of struggle with. And therefore, I believe that, let's say, a platform like Second Innings is speaking to that audience, saying, how do we start planning for that? And that could well be in your late 30s as well. But the fact that you need to plan for it, right? There is no kind of, like you said, you could always be financially in a position where you can play golf for the rest of your life and hang out on the beach. But your life has to have much more purpose, much more identity for you to live a very fulfilling life till whatever your longevity should grant you. And, thankfully, it's going to be hopefully longer for a lot of us folks. But I think that's the process that you need to
Let's talk a bit about the mindset change. Somebody who's got a good, cushy job in a large company, getting a lot of money, they, I think, realize that, once they're out it'll be difficult for them to get a similar job outside because those opportunities are very few and far between. But then their thing is, okay, what am I going to do? Like one of the guests said, you know what, that I had these ideas, but I never ventured out because I was so used to my lifestyle. And suddenly I didn't want to be going and knocking on people's doors and trying to get business because I've never done that. It's like I don't even have a secretary, I don't have an infrastructure, right? So you get
Yeah.
used to a certain lifestyle. So how does one make that transition? Because suddenly I think that requires a lot of vulnerability, humility to be
Yeah.
able to, like you said, right? Some suddenly you're like pitching to people who are half your age. So that
And
requires
Suman, if
a
you
phenomenal one. Yeah.
Suman, if you recall, Uma had once mentioned on one of our episodes that she suddenly realized that her name on her card was larger than the logo in terms of reputation, as compared to her last job where the logo was much more well known than her
Yeah.
name. So that
Yes.
suddenly changes your dynamic of what you're doing because you're now going with your name rather than the logo on the card.
So I think that's a great point. And, I must say, it's the one part that I believe I've navigated very successfully. I think we all recognize that. Anyone who spent more than 10 years, and I did close to 30, you start to realize that a lot of who you are is the value of the card of the big corporation that you're holding. And it gives you a sense of respect and all the trimmings that come with it.
Yeah.
And one of the first things that you miss is really the chatra chaya, the kind of support of that big corporation, right? So the first couple of months tends to be difficult. Positive moments. I think a good friend, kind of mentor, couple of years senior to me in Pepsi, guy called Prakash Iyer once told me. And Prakash did this transition very well. He was the head of Kimberly Clark in India, decided to turn entrepreneur.
Same
He said the
gentleman who
one
keeps writing books and all.
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
One of the things I learned from him, and I do adopt even to this day, and I was telling Atul about this very recently, is that the idea of building a small discipline of having whatever it is, 4 hours, 5 hours, or whatever, in your home office, right? A lot of us are privileged to have a room to ourselves in a home office where you get down to kind of a work mode, right? It might mean, and I told Atul this as well, is that where you get into a semi-formal mode, right? Very often I'm in shorts, but at least the top half of my video screen is relatively formal. It could be a kind of shirt, but it's my workspace where I don't have television on. I try to keep distractions off, right? So the 4 or 5 hours that I schedule my calls, do whatever little business, but it's the kind of routine. It's a Monday to Friday routine. It's my going to work, right? And I think it's a nice discipline. The second that I strongly advocate, and I think you get used to it and it's very liberating, is then just planning out your own calendar and just getting your own bookings and hotels in place. And a lot of us have reached a stage where at some point someone was planning our calendar and someone was taking care of hotels and bookings. It's never been a better time.
And the flip side of it is when the logo is not known, but people are calling you for work, that gives you a good high because now they're valuing you, not the organization, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's the personal branding that's coming into play.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so add just one more point, which I recognize and I tell a lot of friends who are still navigating the journey. I think it's the importance of building your own personal brand and visibility.
Yeah.
What happens is the moment you move out of a large corporate, you kind of fall off the radars. You stop getting called to, these little conferences, panels, groups, or CII or FICCI or whatever it is. And now you're on your own, right? Now it's very, very easy to drop off. I think using the first 2 years when relationship is still fresh and going back to some of these general secretaries or what these guys are and kind of reminding them that you exist and maybe you could add value to XYZ, right? I'm an SME on subject matter expert on XYZ, whatever, right? So that's something you're going to consciously do, right? No one's going to reach out to you because
that's a part of showing up again.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So the ability to actually consciously do that. The other part that, I proudly say I do is I also kind of set aside an objective saying every month I'll put out at least 2 op-eds, right? So thought leadership in a manner of speaking, but on subjects that I'm passionate about, that are relevant to me, and something that I could write using my experience and also using a little bit of the experience I'm picking up from the businesses that I actively engaged with. So I have a personal target of, say, putting out 2 op-eds a month, ideally in national newspapers, and just been around long enough to build some credibility so editors still welcome some of those pieces. But I think the importance of staying in the radar, staying visible.
Absolutely.
I'm gonna throw in. I'm gonna just one second. I'm gonna throw in something which is slightly tangential but relevant, and you may not see it, Lloyd, because of your vantage point being slightly different. I've been running Candid for almost 30 years now, and I've worked with marketing people across categories, across brands, maybe 1,000 different individual people like yourself, right? And I can tell you, and this is related to that name and logo discussion we were just having. There are people who have a big logo on their card, but still give a lot of importance to their own name in terms of my word is worth something. Don't throw the clout of the brand so much. And as an agency, I can tell you that I value that, because then you're dealing with a human being who values who he is more than the brand on his card. Now, that over a period of time layers on tremendous value to the ecosystem around him. So you're talking about, for example, going to general secretaries of organizations, etc. The value to those people is far greater from a person who's always valued his name, even though there was a big brand on the card. And you can't fake that. Over a period of 2 decades, 3 decades, what an individual has built up cannot be faked. Those are relationships that you've built. And that, when you don't have the logo, has tremendous value. So what I'm trying to say is that people who are today have a big logo on their card must always give importance to their name on the card to a large extent when dealing with third parties, etc., because it's going to come back to you at some point in your career.
Absolutely.
So that's just something
And
that
we have talked about this, Atul. In fact,
yeah,
this is linked to our networking, and research shows that most people who are working, they don't network, right? And suddenly, when you're out of a job, now you're trying to network. The point is,
and it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that.
You can't dig a well when you're thirsty. You have to dig it much earlier.
Yeah.
At one point, if I'd like to add on to what you guys are saying, totally agree, is also one important aspect of networking is social media. And I want to say that again, something I kind of stumbled upon. I think back in whatever, maybe early 2012, whatever. I used to be with the Tatas then. I suddenly realized that I was getting into discussions on social media usage with the agency and people talking about LinkedIn and Instagram and Twitter. And I was barely a user. And I realized that the only way you understand this medium is when you dive in, hook, line, and sinker. Right? You can never learn it through reports. Right? And therefore, I kind of got deeper. I don't enjoy all of them. I mean, I must be confessed, I'm still a Insta novice. I don't understand Insta at all. But I recognize that today, one has to create these little ripples across important social media, both at some level as a context of networking and keeping your brand alive or keeping the radar, but two is also a great source of information to know what's happening. I have this principle that I will post twice a week on LinkedIn, right? And therefore I have a bank of ideas. Interesting ideas strike me, which I make a note of. And then suddenly on Friday, I said, oh, this week I've done only one post. Let me work something. But it's always about an idea that's excited me. I'm obviously not very active on Instagram. And Twitter is quite a passion place because you get so much of your news, right? So it's easy to buy. There, of course, is the reverse discipline, right? Things you shouldn't be talking about, don't get into. And it's very exciting to get swamped into political and such like. I've transgressed sometimes, I've been guilty. But by and large, stay kind of uncontroversial. But LinkedIn, certainly, I think it's a good place and certainly somewhere where you can actually put out a point of view that could be relevant to your audience, specifically when you're dealing with cross-cultural audiences. I do believe that, like I said, my life is in two parts. One part is with older folks like me on boards and such like, and one part is with a very, very younger, different, new age, digital first generation. And therefore, I need to be spending my time roughly equally in both. So I kind of stay conscious of that. But I think it's important to kind of build that habit, right? It's not natural. It's not natural as you get older.
Okay, so Lloyd, I just wanted to delve a little deeper into, understanding that you talked about earlier that you went for that course to London, and you kind of relooked at where your next few years of your life in professional as well personal terms were going to go. And I just want to understand, how did you go about figuring out what you would want to do? Was it something that you believed was your purpose, your passion, or you were just simply taking your functional capabilities and expertise forward? How did you kind of go about building that thought process of what you wanted to do after HP?
Thanks. Atul, the moment was kind of confronted me in a funny way. HP was doing some restructuring. It meant that if I were to continue wanting to do what I was doing and get my next level, I would have to move to the US, right? I was in my early 50s then. It was a tough question that one had to face, right? It meant positive things in a career, linear career manner, but it also meant that you have to recognize that I had a mom in her early 80s. My in-laws were both getting by in Bangalore, mom in Bombay. And my wife and me looked and said, are we at this stage good enough to go right across, right? Singapore in that sense is like one more city in India. You're like 2.5 hours away. So we thought long and hard and said, no, this won't work. Let's get back. Right. At that time, I was very clear that I did not get into another CXO kind of role, which would have been the logical thing to attempt to do. And therefore, I said, I'll take a year off, spend time with the folks, give whatever, but also use it to reflect and think about what I can do next. Do I want to be an entrepreneur? Can I get started afresh with some great ideas I had and so on and so forth? At that point in time, a lot of that year, besides tending to family, was really going out and meeting old friends, activating old networks. I spent a lot of time with a lot of VCs and funders I knew. That's a world, let's say, I knew and people of my vintage were largely into. And that's when I kind of recognized that the startup universe is a good place to do both. One, it is to some extent financially rewarding if you can negotiate sweat equity or whatever it is with early stage companies. Two, it meets a lot of the other goals I talked about in the context of keeping oneself mentally refreshed and so on and so forth. Third, and most importantly, it gives you the flexibility of time. So that was my entry point to the portfolio life, as I would like to call it, right? Where you can do a fair amount of work, but you can alter your work to make time for your personal life. And personal life was not just about holidaying and such like, but also spending time with older folks, parents, in-laws, giving time to people who matter. Also recognizing the life stage you are in. That's a duty, at least in the context of the age we're growing up in. So I think that was the point that made me kind of reflect and therefore make that switch. And therefore I did it very, very consciously. But that 1 year was a lot of experimenting, right? To be honest, like I said, the first engagement I had was the pretty well-known VC firm that got me onto a portfolio of their companies, which was like a kind of sweat equity, right? So I was being paid by the firm saying, spend so and so time, help these companies meet their objectives because we invested in them with a certain trajectory. They're nowhere near that trajectory. Things are going all right. Can you help? So I was like the senior statesman in the room on behalf of the funder, which was nice. So it gave me a certain locus standi. But it's also terrible because founders don't trust people who come from the funding ecosystem. It's like, whatever. And therefore, I learned a lot of the ropes. And possibly by the end of the year, I decided that the only way it can work is if I can do it myself. I do not want to again have a boss or someone who's so-called paying me for my services. And then I kind of evolved my own model and did direct deals and worked forward. Parallelly, also building a small portfolio of personal investments. That's where my angel investing started. And then realized that this element of learning or this kind of expertise I built was equally transformative to get onto the board level, right? The first board I stumbled upon with ex-colleague, but suddenly realized that what you're doing for startups, you're doing for larger companies because they both want someone to take an external view and guide you on things they're possibly doing. With the larger companies, I'm bringing the knowledge and experience of the 30 odd years I put into the corporate world and some of my new learnings with the startups. With the startups, I'm of course bringing my expertise and knowledge, but also bringing my Rolodex, so to speak, right? I can pick up the phone and speak to 4 or 5 people that gets the founder to meet a decision maker that by himself he'd never be able to do. So I kind of, it became that perfect mix that I stumbled upon, right? This wasn't my going in hypothesis. This wasn't my investment philosophy. But this is what I kind of arrived at, and it's still work in progress. But it's getting better by the day, if I could, say so myself.
That's brilliant. That's great. I mean, I can see a clear theme of multiple things that you've been doing, and showing up is definitely one of the big ones, which and the discipline and the kind of aligning with not just floating through things, but actually having a plan to do what you need to do, thinking through things. So that brings me to an interesting question, kind of, Lloyd, which is that if you were to do your transition again, and I'm treating your transition from the time when you went to the course, which was, I think you mentioned, in your late 40s, to now, what are the kind of decisions you took? What are the ones you would say you would do again, definitely, because they work for you? And what would you do some things differently?
I think the one that most happy was to have direct engagements with startups. And people ask me very often, what's my investment philosophy or what's my thinking? I think the one that's worked most for me is to work with founders who had some history with, right? And like I said, having been on the block for 30 odd years in the corporate world, you build certain relationships. And it's always good to work with someone you had a past relationship with. You understand the person much better. There's a much higher trust factor. And I do believe that the biggest criticality in investments is having a one-to-one with the founder and recognizing his caliber and his character, right? Something that we often underemphasize. Very often we think it's businesses we know and such like. For me, the few exits I've had, the most successful ones have always been people I've worked with in the past and therefore understand very well. So I think that part's very
Superb.
good. I see myself doing this for at least 10 or 15 years without any drop in pace or passion.
That's amazing. That's such a strong statement of intent, Lloyd. I think final question I'd have, talking to our audience, whether they're in their 20s, 30s, well, more like 30s and 40s and 50s, what would be your advice? And feel free to give different advice to different age groups, because obviously everyone has a different stage of life, etc. What would be your advice, kind of, which you would suggest to people if they want to make the transition to a second innings?
Yeah, I think the two strong muscles I would like everyone to build, whether you're early stage or whatever stage in career or life, I think is what I call resilience and empathy. And in a sense, they're both related. The reason I say so is that pandemic 2020 taught a whole lot of us, all of us, I would say, the importance of resilience, right? Things weren't going right for a vast majority of people. We've all seen folks around us get impacted, businesses go down the tube, the world disrupted like never before, and hopefully never again. Though at these times saying that sounds funny. But I would say, therefore, the art of building strong resilience, right? I always look back at the last 5 years and say there are businesses that have come out doing much better. And there are businesses that somehow have lost their way, right? And I think resilience is a lot. I think, and therefore that's a lot of, as people, how quick are we to change, pivot, whatever else you call it. But I think building resilience as a muscle is something that we strongly underestimate. And it's something that comes with practice. Like you said, showing up, right? A lot of the little disciplines, the small micro disciplines you put in place, your to-do list, your number of hours spent at work in terms of dedicated time, you're showing up for a meeting, you're going out and meeting people physically 5 times a month or whatever it takes, right? When you know pretty much it can get done over the phone. I think some of those closely related to that, my other advice is building the muscle of empathy. And I say this again with the pandemic as a big backdrop, is I think a lot of us, as we grow in hierarchy, in scale, in stature, financially, otherwise, we tend to kind of diminish, right? Showing any kind of emotion and empathy in a corporate setup is considered weak and stupid. I think that's not true at all. Now, I'm saying this now from a little bit of the board perspective. I see some of the most successful CEOs and CXOs are the ones who care a lot about their people in the organization. So while they all lead with the results and their last quarter's revenues and etc., the ones who quickly break off and talk about some important things that happened in the organization, some people changes, they just talk about people in their company, I think are the ones who might have a much better handle on the business. Empathy is a skill. So empathy, resilience, I think can never go out of fashion, and they're important things. And they both require a little bit of working on, right? We all come with a small dose that's built into our DNA, but a lot of it is actually working on. It's like your relationships, right? The more you invest and nurture them, the better they turn.
It's been a great conversation, Lloyd. Thanks a lot. We really appreciate your time, and you've given us great perspective, not only from your own personal experiences, but also from all the various people you've worked with over the years. Thank you so much, and we look forward to staying in touch with you and talking to you about other people's second innings as well.
Thank you, Atul. Thanks, Suman. Enjoyed being on this podcast.
Likewise. Thank you so much.